He expected a black-edged letter delivered by a slow-moving country solicitor, announcing the quiet, dignified death of the woman he had married and promptly forgotten. He had, after all, purchased her for that specific purpose, to be a duchess in name only, a placeholder to satisfy the crown's tiresome insistence on his line, and to then have the good grace to succumb to the consumption that already rattled in her frail chest. He expected to inherit a quiet title of widower, a brief and inconvenient period of mourning, and then a return to the clean, cold calculus of politics and power that was his life's blood. He did not expect to return to the ancestral tomb he had banished her to, and find it fiercely, defiantly alive. He did not expect to find her, not in a grave, but on a throne of her own making, ruling a kingdom he had abandoned. And he certainly did not expect that in the face of her impossible survival, he would find the one thing he had never sought, a home. The solicitor's office was a study in shades of gray. Gray light filtered through a tall, grimy window, illuminating motes of dust that danced in the air like bored ghosts. The walls were gray, the color of old dishwater, and the ledgers stacked on the shelves were bound in gray, cracking leather. Even the air seemed gray, thick with the scent of decaying paper and the damp wool of the three people gathered within its suffocating confines. Duke Alastair Beaumont, the fourth Duke of Blackwood, felt the colorlessness of the room seep into him, a familiar and not entirely unwelcome sensation. It mirrored the landscape of his own soul. He stood by the window, his back to the room, gazing out at the slick, wet cobblestones of a dreary London street. He was a man built on a grand scale, tall and broad-shouldered, a physical reality that seemed to shrink the already small office. His black greatcoat, impeccably tailored, was a slash of absolute darkness against the muted tones of the room. He was thinking of troop movements on the continent, of a proposed grain tariff that would destabilize the northern counties, of a subtle shift in allegiance he had noted in Lord Ashworth at the club the previous evening. He was thinking of anything and everything but the business being conducted behind him. This was a duty, like signing death warrants or attending a tedious court function. It was a problem to be solved with a signature and a sum of gold, nothing more. "The terms are agreeable, Your Grace," a reedy voice said, slicing through his thoughts. It was Mr. Finch, the solicitor, a man who seemed to be constructed entirely of dry twigs and nervous gestures. Alastair did not turn. "And the lady?" he asked, his voice a low rumble that vibrated through the floorboards. Behind him, a chair scraped. "My cousin is most agreeable, Your Grace," a new voice chimed in, this one slick with an eager, almost desperate sycophancy. Alastair recognized it as belonging to the man named Marcus Vance, the woman's last living relative. A man with grasping hands and the scent of financial ruin clinging to him like cheap cologne. He was selling his only cousin, a sickly orphan, to the highest bidder. The Duke was simply the highest bidder imaginable. "She has a voice, I presume," Alastair stated, his tone flat. It was not a question. He finally turned, his gaze sweeping over the pathetic tableau. Finch was wringing his hands. Marcus Vance was half risen from his chair, his face a mask of perspiring eagerness. And seated between them was the commodity, Alara Vance. He had been told her name, but it had failed to register. She was small, lost in a drab gray dress that had clearly been mended more than once. Her face was pale, almost translucent, the skin stretched taut over fine cheekbones. Her only color was in the feverish brightness of her eyes, a startling, lucid blue, and the faint, unhealthy flush high on her cheeks. She was holding a handkerchief to her mouth, and as he watched, her shoulders shook with a suppressed, rattling cough. She was exactly as advertised, a beautiful ruin, already halfway to the grave. Perfect, a wife who would demand nothing, expect nothing, and shortly be nothing at all. Alara felt his gaze like a physical weight. It was not the lecherous gaze of the men her cousin had tried to parade her before in the past, nor the pitying glance of doctors. It was something far colder, far more unnerving. It was the look of a man appraising an object. A chair, a horse, a piece of land. He was assessing her worth based on her frailty, her capacity for a swift and unobtrusive demise. The humiliation of it was a cold, smooth stone in her belly. She met his eyes, refusing to look away to show the weakness he was so clearly banking on. His eyes were the color of a winter storm, chips of flint that held no warmth, no curiosity, nothing but a vast, empty distance. He was not here, not really. His body was in this room, but his mind was on a throne, in a war room 1,000 miles away. "I find the terms acceptable," she said. Her voice was quiet, hoarse from the cough, but it carried a surprising note of clarity in the stuffy room. Her cousin Marcus shot her a furious, panicked look, as if she had just spoken out of turn at her own auction. Alistair's eyebrow lifted a fraction of an inch. It was the only sign of surprise he had shown. He had expected a whispered assent, or perhaps just a timid nod. He had not expected the directness, the unnerving intelligence in those fever-bright eyes. It was a minor inconvenience, a flicker of spirit in a body he had paid to be spiritless. He moved to the desk, the room seeming to rearrange itself around his presence. Finch scurried to dip a quill in the ink pot, holding it out with a trembling hand. Alistair took it, his large, scarred fingers dwarfing the delicate feather. He scanned the document, though he already knew its contents by heart. Alara Vance, spinster of the parish, in exchange for the settlement of all outstanding debts of her cousin, Marcus Vance, and a generous annuity to be paid to said cousin upon her death, agrees to be joined in matrimony to Alistair Beaumont, Duke of Blackwood. It was a death warrant dressed in the legal finery of a marriage contract. He signed his name. The scratch of a nib was the only sound in the room, loud as a sword being drawn from its scabbard. Then he pushed the document across the desk toward her. Alara stood, her legs feeling unsteady. The effort of holding herself upright, of meeting that glacial gaze, had cost her more than she cared to admit. She walked to the desk, picked up the quill, and signed her name beneath his. Her script was small but firm, a line of defiance against the sprawling, arrogant signature of the Duke. She was signing away her life, what little was left of it. But in that moment, staring at the two names linked on the page, she felt a strange, cold sense of freedom. She was no longer Marcus's burden. She was no longer a pawn in his desperate financial games. She was now the property of a man who wanted her dead. And in that, there was a peculiar, stark honesty she had not known in years. "It is done," Alistair said, his voice devoid of any emotion. He placed a heavy purse of gold on the desk, a final, insulting payment to her cousin. Marcus's eyes latched onto it, his relief so palpable it was nauseating. "A carriage will be ready in the morning to convey the Duchess to Blackwood Manor." The title sounded like a mockery on his lips. The Duchess. He turned to her then, his expression unreadable. "My duties require my presence elsewhere. The housekeeper at the manor, Mrs. Gable, will see to your needs. You are to want for nothing." The words were a formula, recited by rote. What he meant was clear. "Go to this place I have prepared for you. Do not trouble me. Be quietly." He did not offer his hand. He did not say a word of farewell. He simply nodded once, a curt, dismissive gesture, and then he was gone. The door closed behind him, and the room felt both larger and emptier. The gray light seemed to reclaim the space his dark form had occupied. Marcus lunged for the purse, his hands shaking as he counted the coins. "See, Alara," he said, his voice thick with a triumphant glee she found repulsive. "I told you I would provide for you. A duchess. You are a duchess." Alara looked at her cousin, at the craven joy on his face, and then at the closed door through which her new husband had disappeared. She felt the familiar rattle begin deep in her chest, a cough that shook her slight frame. She was a duchess, the Duchess of Blackwood. It was a title for a ghost, a name for a tombstone. She had been sold, paid for, and now she was to be shipped to her final resting place. A cold, hard knot of something that was not quite despair and not quite anger settled in her heart. It was resolve. He expected her to die. Her cousin expected her to die. The world expected her to die. Fine, she thought, pulling her thin shawl tighter around her shoulders. But she would do it on her own terms. The journey north was a descent into a colder, wetter hell. The carriage the Duke had sent was well-sprung and upholstered in dark, cracking leather, but no amount of comfort could keep out the pervasive damp. A relentless, weeping rain had begun the moment they left the grimy outskirts of London, and it had not ceased. It drummed a monotonous, mournful rhythm on the roof and sluiced down the windows, blurring the passing world into a watercolor of greens and grays. Alara sat alone, huddled in a corner, a heavy traveling rug tucked around her legs. The chill was not just in the air. It was a living thing, a damp presence that seeped through the wood and wool, seeking out her bones. It settled in her lungs, a familiar, unwelcome guest, making each breath a conscious effort. She had not seen the Duke again. A footman had collected her from her cousin's threadbare lodgings, his face a mask of professional indifference. Her single, battered trunk had been loaded, the door had been closed, and she had been sealed into this mobile prison. For 2 days, they traveled. The landscape shifted from the gentle, rolling fields of the south to a wilder, more desolate beauty. The trees grew stooped and gnarled, bent by a constant wind she could not feel but could sense in their very forms. The hills swelled into rugged, heather-choked moorland, vast and empty under a sky the color of slate. There were no charming villages, no welcoming coaching inns. They stopped only to change horses at grim, isolated posting houses where stable hands stared at the ducal crest on the carriage door with a mixture of awe and suspicion. She did not read. The relentless jolting made the words swim on the page. She did not sleep, not truly, but drifted in a state of semi-conscious misery, her thoughts as gray and repetitive as the rain. She thought of the Duke, Alistair Beaumont. She pictured his cold, flint-gray eyes, the imposing wall of his shoulders, the utter absence of warmth or kindness in his face. He was less a man than a force of nature, a glacier moving with unstoppable, indifferent force. He had carved her out of her life and set her adrift, and he had done it without a second thought. He was already back in his world of politics and power, and she was a loose end, neatly tied and disposed of. Blackwood Manor. The name itself was a premonition. On the evening of the second day, the carriage slowed, its wheels sucking at thick, clinging mud. Alara pushed aside the leather curtain and peered out. The rain had momentarily eased to a miserable drizzle. Through the gathering dusk and swirling mist, she saw it. Blackwood Manor rose from the landscape, not like a home, but like a geological formation, a jagged outcrop of dark, weeping stone. It was immense, a sprawling Gothic monstrosity of towers and gables and black-toothed crenellations. It looked less like it had been built and more like it had been clawed from the earth. The grounds were a wilderness. What might once have been lawns were now knee-high fields of rank grass and weeds. The drive was a treacherous bog of mud and standing water. Ivy, thick as a man's arm, crawled over the stone walls, choking the life from the masonry and covering many of the windows in a shroud of dark green. A few windows were boarded up. Others were just black, empty sockets like the eyes of a skull. There was no light, no sign of life, save for a single, hesitant plume of smoke rising from 100 chimneys, a weak pulse in a dying beast. Her heart, which she had thought immune to any further sinking, dropped into the pit of her stomach. This was not a house. It was a tomb, his tomb, and now it was to be hers. The carriage lurched to a halt before a massive, iron-studded oak door. The silence that followed the cessation of the wheels and the drumming rain was profound, broken only by the mournful cry of some unseen bird and the drip of water from a broken gutter. The footman, his face grim, opened the door and lowered the steps into a puddle of viscous mud. "Your Grace," he said, his voice flat. Alara gathered her shawl and the traveling rug, her limbs stiff and cold. She took a breath of the damp, earthy air. It smelled of wet stone, of decay, of centuries of rain and neglect. It was the smell of her future. She descended the steps, her thin-soled boot sinking into the cold mud. She stood there for a moment, a small, solitary figure in gray, dwarfed by the oppressive facade of the house. Her trunk was unceremoniously dumped beside her. And then she heard it, the sound of another carriage, heavier, with a faster team of horses. A second vehicle, which had been following at a distance, pulled up alongside her own. The door opened, and he emerged. The Duke. Alistair stepped out of his personal traveling coach, his boots landing with a splash in the mire. He had not ridden with her. Of course he had not. He had followed in his own conveyance, maintaining a physical and symbolic distance. He looked as immaculate as he had in the solicitor's office, his greatcoat shedding the rain, his expression a mask of weary impatience. He had come only to see the transaction to its final conclusion, to deliver the goods and receive his receipt of silence. He strode toward the great oak door, ignoring her completely. He raised a gloved fist and struck it 3 times. The sound echoed, flat and dead. For a long moment, nothing happened. Then, with a groan of protesting hinges and the shriek of a rusty bolt being drawn, the door creaked open a few inches. A sliver of pale, suspicious face peered out. "Your Grace," a woman's voice said, thin and sharp. "You were not expected. I am here, Gable. That is all you need to know," Alistair said, his voice cutting through the damp air. "This is the Duchess. See to her." He turned then, and his gaze finally fell upon Alara, standing in the mud, shivering in the drizzle. For an instant, a flicker of something unreadable crossed his face. Was it pity? Annoyance? Regret? It was gone as quickly as it appeared, replaced by the familiar glacial mask. He had fulfilled his duty. He had brought her here. His part in this sordid play was over. "The North Wing has been prepared for you," he said, his words directed not quite at her, but at the space she occupied. "You will find it quiet. Quiet as a grave," Alara thought. He did not wait for a reply. He did not offer a hand, or a word of comfort, or even a simple acknowledgement of their shared name. He turned his back on her, on the hulking, dark house, on the life he was consigning her to. He strode back to his carriage, the mud sucking at his gleaming boots. "Your Grace," Alara said, the words escaping her before she could stop them. He paused, his hand on the carriage door, but he did not turn around. "Is there anything else?" he asked, his voice laced with an almost exhausted impatience. She looked at his broad, unyielding back, at the rigid line of his shoulders. She looked at the decaying mausoleum that was to be her home. She felt the rain plastering her hair to her cold skin. And in that moment, the last vestiges of fear and humiliation burned away, leaving behind a pure, white-hot coal of defiance. "No," she said, her voice clear and steady, carrying across the muddy yard. "There is nothing else." He did not look back. He climbed into his carriage, the door slammed shut, and with a crack of the whip and a spray of mud, he was gone, disappearing back into the mist and the gathering night. Alara was left alone in the rain, with her single trunk and the cold, unwelcoming eyes of the housekeeper peering at her from the doorway. She was abandoned, utterly and completely. She took a deep, shuddering breath of the cold, damp air, the scent of wet earth and decay filling her lungs. This place was meant to kill her. He had brought her here to die. She lifted her chin, squared her slender shoulders, and began to walk toward the dark, gaping maw of the house. A duchess does not stand in the mud. She would enter her tomb not as a victim, but as its new queen. The room they gave her was a cage of cold. It was vast, cavernous, and situated in the notorious north wing the Duke had so chillingly recommended. A towering dust-shrouded canopied bed dominated the space, its dark draperies smelling faintly of mildew and the passage of forgotten years. The air was frigid, holding a dampness that clung to everything. The threadbare tapestries on the wall depicting a fated, bloody hunt, the dark, heavy furniture, the very marrow of her bones. A fire had been lit in the cavernous grate, but it was a pathetic, sullen thing, a handful of damp logs that hissed and sulked, producing more smoke than heat. The smoke, unable to escape up the blocked chimney, coiled in the upper reaches of the room like a malevolent spirit, adding the scent of cold ash to the prevailing odors of decay. Mrs. Gable, the housekeeper, had shown her to the room with a grim, pursed-lipped silence that was more insulting than any words. She was a tall, skeletal woman with a face that looked as if it had been carved from a sour turnip. Her black dress was stiff with starch and disapproval. She had pointed to the bed. "Your Grace's chambers," she had announced, the title dripping with sarcastic disbelief. Then she had left, closing the heavy door with a finality that felt like a prison gate clanging shut. Alara stood in the center of the room, her traveling cloak still damp on her shoulders, and shivered. This was a deliberate act of cruelty, a room designed to nurture a sickness, to leech the life from a body already struggling to hold on to it. The Duke's parting words echoed in her mind. "You will find it quiet." He had known. He had chosen this room for her himself, or had left instructions for it to be chosen. It was a sentence delivered with chilling pragmatism. For a week, she succumbed. The journey, the cold, the profound shock of her abandonment, all conspired to shatter her fragile health. The cough returned with a vengeance, a deep, barking thing that tore her throat and left her breathless and weak. She spent most of her days in the monstrous bed, lost in its cold, musty linens, drifting in a feverish haze. A young, frightened-looking maid named Beth would bring her trays of thin, greasy broth and weak tea, her eyes wide with a mixture of pity and fear. She would scurry in and out, avoiding Alara's gaze, clearly under the housekeeper's strict orders to do the bare minimum. Mrs. Gable herself would appear once a day, standing in the doorway with her arms crossed, her expression one of grim, patient expectation. She was a vulture waiting. She would ask, in her thin, reedy voice, if her Grace required anything. The question of formality she clearly expected to be met with silence or a weak shake of the head. She was waiting for Alara to give up, to fade away as Alara suspected others had faded away in this house before her. The days blurred into a monotonous cycle of coughing fits, fever dreams, and the slow ticking of a tarnished clock on the mantelpiece. The house itself seemed depressing on her. She would hear it groaning and settling around her, the sigh of the wind in the broken eaves, the scuttling of unseen things in the walls, the relentless drip, drip, drip of water somewhere down the long, dark corridor. It was a house that was actively rotting, and it was trying to take her with it. This was her lowest point, a nadir of despair, so profound it was almost peaceful. It would be so easy to just let go, to close her eyes and allow the cold to claim her. It was, after all, what everyone expected. It was what she had been paid for. One morning, she awoke to a sliver of watery sunlight piercing the grime on the tall window. It illuminated a path of dust motes, a swirling galaxy of neglect. Her head was clearer than it had been in days. The fever had receded, leaving behind a bone-deep weakness and a gnawing emptiness in her stomach. The broth on her bedside table was cold. A skin of grease congealed on its surface. She looked at it, at the gray, unappetizing liquid, and a sudden, violent wave of revulsion washed over her. It was followed by a surge of pure, unadulterated rage. It was a white-hot clarity, a fire that burned away the fog of sickness and despair. She would not die in this bed. She would not drink another spoonful of Mrs. Gable's dishwater broth. She would not give that cold, absent Duke the satisfaction of a neat and tidy death certificate. She had been a survivor her entire life, surviving her parents' deaths, her cousin's feckless cruelty, the poverty that had dogged her every step. She had survived so much. She would be damned if she let a drafty room and a sour-faced housekeeper be the end of her. She threw back the heavy, damp covers. Her legs, when she swung them over the side of the bed, were as shaky and unreliable as a newborn foal's. The floorboards were like sheets of ice against her bare feet, the shock of it jarring her. She stood, swaying, gripping the bedpost for support. Her nightgown was thin and offered no protection against the room's deep chill. She saw her reflection in a large, clouded mirror across the room, a wraith, a pale, stick-thin figure with wild, dark hair and eyes that burned with a feverish new light. She did not look like a dying woman. She looked like a cornered animal. She saw the bell pull, a frayed, tasseled rope hanging by the fireplace. With deliberate, shuffling steps, she made her way to it. Each step was an act of war against the weakness in her body. She reached it, her breath coming in ragged gasps, and she pulled. She pulled it not once, but 3 times, the jangling of the distant bell a declaration. It was the young maid, Beth, who answered, cracking the door open and peering in nervously. Her eyes widened in shock to see Alara standing, swaying but upright by the cold hearth. Your Grace, she stammered. Fetch Mrs. Gable, Alara commanded. Her voice was a hoarse whisper, but it held a new, unyielding core of iron. And then pack my things. Minutes later, the housekeeper appeared, her face a thundercloud of displeasure. You should be in bed, she snapped, foregoing any pretense of respect. I will not be spending another night in this mausoleum, Alara said, her voice gaining strength with every word. This wing is uninhabitable. It is damp, it is freezing, and the chimney is blocked. It is a health hazard. Mrs. Gable drew herself up. His Grace himself instructed that these rooms were to be prepared for you. His Grace is not here, Alara countered, her gaze locking with the older woman's. I am, and as the lady of this house, I am ordering you to move me to a room in the south wing, one that is dry, and one with a functioning fireplace. Immediately, the housekeeper was momentarily stunned into silence. She had expected a complaint, a whimper, not a direct command. She saw the fire in Alara's eyes, the inflexible set of her jaw, and for the first time, a flicker of uncertainty crossed her sour face. This was not the meek, dying creature she had been tending. The south wing has not been used in years, she protested weakly. It is not prepared. Then prepare it, Alara said, her voice dropping to a dangerously quiet level. Find a room, air it, and build a proper fire. Lay out my clothes, and then bring me a pot of hot, strong tea and something to eat. Something other than that gray sludge you call broth. Bread, cheese, anything. Do it now. She turned away, a clear dismissal, and walked back to the bed, her strength failing. She sat on the edge, her back ramrod straight, refusing to collapse back into the pillows. She did not watch to see if her orders were obeyed. She simply waited, listening to the furious, silent battle being waged in the doorway. After a long moment, she heard Mrs. Gable give a sharp, frustrated sigh and the swish of her skirts as she turned and marched away. Alara allowed herself a small, grim smile. The first shot had been fired. The reclamation had begun. The room she chose in the south wing was smaller, but it was a world away from the northern tomb. 2 tall windows faced the afternoon sun, and though they were dirty, they let in a warm, golden light that made the dust dance in a cheerful, friendly way. The fireplace drew beautifully, and within an hour, a roaring fire was crackling in the grate, throwing heat and a comforting, resinous scent of pine into the air. The room was not grand, but it was dry and warm. It was defensible. From this new base of operations, Alara began her campaign. For the first few days, she did not leave the room, conserving her strength, eating the slightly more substantial food that was now brought to her, and breathing in the clean, warm air. But she was not idle. She had demanded that any and all of the estate's account books and ledgers be brought to her. They arrived in a dusty, precarious stack, delivered by a grudging footman under Mrs. Gable's baleful eye. They smelled of mildew and neglect, their pages brittle and yellowed. Alara, propped up in an armchair by the fire with a blanket over her knees, began to work. Her father had been a merchant before his failed ventures, and he had taught her letters and numbers, instilling in her a head for practical sums. The ledgers were a catastrophe. They were years out of date, filled with incomprehensible scribbles, unpaid bills, and notations of rent from tenants that had clearly not been collected in a decade. The Duke, it seemed, poured a fortune into the estate from his other, vast incomes, but the estate itself was a bleeding wound, hemorrhaging money through sheer, staggering neglect. Mrs. Gable, she discovered, was paying exorbitant prices for supplies from her cousin's shop in the local village. She was paying wages to a dozen ghost employees who no longer lived, or had perhaps never lived, on the estate. The anger that had sparked her recovery now honed itself into a sharp, cold tool. She took a fresh ledger and a pot of ink, and she began to make lists. She started a new account book, her clear, precise hand a stark contrast to the spidery scrawls of the past. She cross-referenced, she calculated, she uncovered layers of graft and incompetence that were breathtaking in their scope. After a week, she felt strong enough to leave her room. Dressed in her plainest, most practical gown, she descended the grand, creaking staircase. The main hall was a gallery of ghosts, the furniture shrouded in white cloths, the air thick and still. She ignored it. She was not interested in reviving the ducal grandeur. She was interested in survival. Her first stop was the kitchens. She found a vast, stone-flagged space, mostly unused, with only one small hearth in operation. A cook, a woman as round and sullen as Mrs. Gable was thin and sour, gave her a resentful look. Alara ignored her too. She went straight to the pantry. As she suspected, it was half empty, stocked with overpriced, poor-quality flour and sacks of rotting potatoes. Her next stop was the housekeeper's office. She walked in without knocking. Mrs. Gable was at her desk, startled. Alara placed the old, damning ledger on the desk beside the new, clean one. "I have reviewed the accounts, Mrs. Gable," she said, her voice calm and even. "I have found discrepancies. Significant ones." She tapped the page where she had detailed the overpayments to the housekeeper's cousin. "You have been defrauding this estate for years." The woman's face went from sour to a mottled, furious purple. "You have no right." "I have every right," Alara cut in, her voice like a whip crack. "I'm the Duchess of Blackwood. This is my house now. Your employment here is terminated. Effective immediately. You will be out by nightfall." For a moment, she thought the woman might strike her. But then Mrs. Gable saw the implacable certainty in Alara's eyes, the proof of her thievery in the ledger, and the fight went out of her. It was replaced by a sputtering, venomous hatred. She spat a curse, gathered her things, and stormed out. The dismissal sent a shockwave through the skeletal staff. It was a coup. Alara promoted Beth, the young, frightened maid, to her personal attendant, and gave the cook a simple choice. Cook well and honestly with the resources provided, or follow Mrs. Gable out the door. The cook, grumbling but pragmatic, chose to stay. The next day, Alara ventured outside. She wrapped herself in a thick wool shawl she'd found in a cedar chest and walked the grounds. It was worse than she had imagined. The gardens were a jungle. The greenhouses had collapsed, their glass panels shattered. But behind the ruin, she saw potential. The walled garden, though choked with weeds, had good southern exposure. The soil, she noted, crumbling a handful between her fingers, was dark and rich. She found the groundsman, a man named Thorn, attempting to scythe a path through the wilderness near the stables. He was old, with a face as weathered as a sea cliff and hands like gnarled roots. He stopped his work as she approached, leaning on his scythe and watching her with cynical, faded blue eyes. He expected her to ask for a rose garden, for some foolish, aristocratic vanity. "Mr. Thorn," she said, pulling the shawl tighter against the wind, "I have no interest in lawns or ornamental flowers." He grunted, waiting. "I'm interested in food," she continued. "I want to clear the walled garden. We will plant potatoes, cabbages, carrots, onions, herbs, things that will grow here, things we can eat and store for winter." Thorn stared at her for a long moment. He looked at her slender frame, her pale face, and then into her fiercely determined eyes. A slow, grudging respect dawned on his weathered features. This was not the sort of Duchess he had ever encountered in stories. This was a woman who knew the difference between a flower and a turnip. "The soil's good," he said, his voice a gravelly rumble. "But the wall is crumbling on the west side, and the gates rusted shut. Then we will fix the wall and we will break the gate," she said simply. "I will hire men from the village if I have to. I will pay them a fair wage, in coin, not credit at a company store, she had found a small coffer of household cash hidden in the Duke's study, enough to begin. From that day on, Thorn became her staunchest ally. He knew the land, he knew the weather, he knew the people in the village. With his guidance, Ilara began to breathe life back into the estate's practical heart. They hired 2 strong lads from the tenant farms. They cleared the walled garden, their hands raw and blistered. Ilara worked alongside them, her fine lady's hands soon stained with dirt and calloused. She learned the rhythms of the land, the satisfaction of physical labor, the simple joy of a straight-plowed furrow. She was relentless. She wrote to the Duke's solicitors in London, her letters crisp and authoritative, demanding they take action against the non-paying tenants in his city properties. Money began to trickle in, a small but steady stream. With it, she paid for roof repairs over the kitchens and the stables, the vital organs of the house. She had the main well cleaned and unblocked. She made a decision that would have horrified any true aristocrat. The vast, decaying north and west wings of the manor were a drain on resources and warmth. She had Thorn and his boys board them up, sealing them off completely. Blackwood Manor was shrinking, contracting around a new, warm, beating heart. They now lived in the south wing, the kitchens, and the servants' quarters above. It was no longer a palace. It was a fortress, hunkered down against the coming winter. The house began to change. The scent of mildew and decay was slowly replaced by the smell of baking bread from the revitalized kitchens, of wood smoke from the clean chimneys, of beeswax used to polish the furniture in the rooms they actually used. Ilara, using herbs from her new garden, made infusions that soothed the lingering rasp in her lungs. The color returned to her cheeks, not the feverish flush of sickness, but the healthy glow of hard work and fresh air. She gained weight. Her body, which had been a fragile prison, became a source of strength. The staff, now a small, loyal, hard-working crew, no longer called her Grace with a sneer. They said it with a deep, abiding respect. She was not some distant lady of the manor. She was the woman who had saved their jobs, who worked beside them, who had brought order from chaos and warmth from cold. She had found the feral, neglected children of the tenant farmers and, in a dry barn she'd had repaired, started a small school, teaching them their letters 2 afternoons a week. She was not just their Duchess, she was their leader. 6 months after her arrival, Ilara stood in the Duke's study. It was her study now. She had aired it, cleaned it, and claimed his vast mahogany desk as her own. It was covered not with calling cards and invitations, but with planting schedules, wage sheets, and the neatly balanced household accounts. The room was warm, the fire burning brightly. Outside, the autumn wind howled, but inside, all was secure. She looked at her reflection in the dark glass of the window. The woman looking back was a stranger. Her hair was simply pinned, her dress was a practical dark wool, and there was a smudge of ink on her cheek. But her eyes were clear, her posture was straight, and there was an expression of calm, unshakable authority on her face. She had arrived as a ghost, a woman sentenced to death. She had survived. More than that, she had built a kingdom from the ruins he had left her in. She was no longer Ilara Vance, the sickly orphan. She was the Duchess of Blackwood, the ruler of her domain. And she was ready for whatever came next. Alastair Beaumont, Duke of Blackwood, was bone-deep weary. The past 6 months in London had been a brutal political campaign fought not on a battlefield with cannons and swords, but in the perfumed drawing rooms and stuffy chambers of Parliament. He had dismantled a coalition led by his rival, Lord Meryton, a man whose ambition was matched only by his incompetence. It had been a victory, but a costly one, achieved through sleepless nights, endless negotiations, veiled threats, and the strategic deployment of carefully gathered secrets. He felt hollowed out, scoured clean of everything but exhaustion. He needed silence, not the charged silence of a council chamber, but a true, deep, empty silence. The silence of the grave, and he knew just the place to find it. As his carriage rattled north, his mind, for the first time in months, turned to the wife he had all but forgotten. Ilara Vance. He presumed she was dead. The country air and the damp of Blackwood Manor would surely have finished the job her weak lungs had already started. He felt a mild, detached curiosity as to whether the local solicitor had sent the notification of her death to his London address, where it would be languishing in a pile of unimportant correspondence. It was an untidy loose end. He would have to see about a headstone in the bleak little churchyard. Something simple. The Duchess of Blackwood. It seemed a grand title for such a fleeting existence. He was not returning to mourn, but to retreat. Blackwood Manor, in its magnificent state of decay, was the perfect sanctuary. It was a place devoid of people, of demands of life. He craved its cold, empty rooms, its groaning silence, its atmosphere of profound neglect. He wanted to sit in a dusty library and hear nothing but the scuttling of mice and the sigh of the wind. He wanted to be a ghost in his own ancestral tomb. The journey was a blur. He slept fitfully, his mind still racing with the ghosts of his political battles. But as they entered his own lands, the wild, untamed sweep of the moors under a vast, gray sky, a measure of peace began to settle over him. This was Blackwood territory. It was as bleak and unforgiving as his own nature. Then he saw the first thing that was wrong. The main gate to the estate, which for years had been a rusted, sagging wreck, half devoured by overgrown briars, now stood straight and tall. The wrought iron had been scraped clean of rust and given a coat of black paint. It swung open smoothly as his carriage approached, manned by a sturdy-looking lad who tipped his cap with a cheerful, unafraid grin. Alistair stared, a frown creasing his brow. This was not right. This was a sign of maintenance. He urged the driver on, a strange sense of unease beginning to prickle at him. The drive, which he remembered as a near-impassable bog, was now a smooth, well-drained gravel road. The verges had been scythed, the overhanging branches of the ancient oaks trimmed back. It was neat, orderly. It was all wrong. And then the house itself came into view. He had been anticipating a skeleton, a dark shape hunched against the sky. Instead, what he saw made him lean forward, his eyes narrowed in disbelief. The choking shroud of ivy had been cut back from the south wing, revealing the clean lines of the stone beneath. The windows, which had been black, empty eyes, were now clean, glinting in the pale autumn light. And from at least 3 chimneys on the south side, plumes of healthy, white smoke curled into the air, a sign of warm, well-stoked fires within. The north wing, he noted, was dark and shuttered, making the living part of the house seem all the more concentrated, all the more vibrant. The house was not dead. It was breathing. A sense of profound irritation, mingled with a bewildering confusion, washed over him. Who had done this? Who had dared to interfere with his perfect, decaying sanctuary? He had left explicit instructions that the estate was to be maintained at a minimal level, a holding pattern of neglect. He had wanted a tomb, not a country home. The carriage pulled up to the front entrance, not in a puddle of mud, but on a clean-swept stone courtyard. Before his footman could even open the door, the great oak portal swung open. An old man with a weathered face and clear blue eyes stood there. Alistair vaguely recognized him as Thorn, the groundsman, a man he had not spoken to in 20 years. Thorn was not stooped or servile. He stood straight, a look of wary, assessing respect on his face. "Your Grace," Thorn said, his voice a low rumble. It was a greeting, not a salutation of groveling deference. "We were not expecting you." Alistair stepped out of the carriage, his gaze sweeping the repaired stonework, the polished brass of the door handle. "Evidently," he said, his own voice tight. "What has been going on here, Thorn?" "Improvements, Your Grace," the old man said simply. Alistair strode into the hall. The change was even more shocking on the inside. The ghostly, shrouded furniture was gone. The air, which he remembered as being thick with the smell of damp and dust, was now clean and smelled of beeswax, dried herbs, and faintly of baking bread. The great hall was still vast and imposing, but it was no longer derelict. A fire, a massive, roaring giant of a fire, blazed in the main hearth, casting a warm, dancing light over the stone flags. The place felt warm. It felt welcoming. He hated it. "Where is Mrs. Gable?" Alistair demanded, turning on the groundsman. "Gone, Your Grace," Thorne said, without a flicker of emotion. "Months ago." "Gone?" "I did not dismiss her." "No, Your Grace," Thorne agreed. "Her Grace did." Alistair froze. The words hung in the warm air, nonsensical. Her Grace. He had been so sure. The black-edged letter, the quiet grave. It had all seemed so inevitable. "Her Grace?" he repeated slowly, the words feeling alien in his mouth. Thorne's weathered face almost broke into a smile. She's in the study, managing the accounts." The study. His study. The one place in this house he had considered his sanctum, even in its dusty, neglected state. He felt a surge of anger so sharp and pure it almost took his breath away. An intruder. A usurper. He had sent a dying woman here to be a ghost, and she had instead become a queen. He stalked across the hall, his boots echoing on the clean-swept stones. He threw open the door to the study without knocking. The scene before him stopped him in his tracks. The room was transformed. Like the hall, it was clean, warm, and alive. A fire crackled in the hearth. The shelves had been dusted, the books organized. And seated at his great mahogany desk, the desk of his father and his grandfather before him, was a woman. It was her, but it was not her. It was not the pale, wraith-like creature from the solicitor's office, the girl with the rattling cough and the shadow of death in her eyes. This woman was slender, yes, but not frail. Her dark hair was pinned back in a simple, practical knot, but a few errant strands had escaped to curl around a face that was no longer pale and translucent. It was a face that held a healthy, subtle color, a face that was intent, focused, intelligent. She was wearing a simple, dark blue wool dress, its cuffs protected from the ink by paper sleeves. An ink smudge adorned one cheek like a warrior's mark. She was surrounded by ledgers and papers, a quill in her hand, the very picture of command. She was not beautiful in the conventional, decorative way of the ladies at court. She was magnificent. She looked up as he burst in, her lucid blue eyes widening for a fraction of a second in surprise. Then her expression became one of cool, unruffled composure. She placed her quill deliberately down on its rest and folded her hands on the ledger before her. She did not rise. She did not act flustered or intimidated. She simply watched him, her gaze level and assessing, as if he were an unexpected and slightly inconvenient tradesman. The silence stretched, thick with unspoken questions and challenges. He had come here seeking a grave and had found a throne. And on that throne sat the woman he had sent here to die. His mind, usually a sharp, analytical machine, was a jumble of disbelief and fury. The first words that came out of his mouth were flat, stupid, a blunt statement of the impossible. "You're alive." A ghost of a smile, cool and laced with irony, touched her lips. She tilted her head slightly, her gaze unwavering. "I apologize for the inconvenience, Your Grace," she replied, her voice as calm and clear as a winter morning. "I trust your journey was tolerable." The sheer, breathtaking audacity of it struck him like a physical blow. The polite, dismissive inquiry of a hostess to an unexpected guest. She had not only survived, she had taken his home, his power, his very title, and was now wielding it against him with the casual grace of a master swordswoman. He was the Duke of Blackwood. This was his house. And yet, standing in the doorway of his own study, facing the woman he had married and discarded, he felt like an intruder. He stepped fully into the room, closing the door behind him with a definitive click. The sound was meant to be an assertion of his authority, but in the warm, well-ordered space she had created, it just sounded like the peevish slam of a petulant child. He felt a muscle jump in his jaw. "What is the meaning of this?" he demanded, his voice low and dangerous. He gestured vaguely around the room, at the fire, the clean windows, the neatly stacked books. This entire house. Alara did not flinch. She simply watched him, her expression one of patient inquiry. "The meaning, Your Grace? I should think it was self-evident. It is a house being lived in rather than one being left to rot. I preferred it rotting, he snapped, the words out before he could stop them. The admission was raw, vulnerable, and he instantly regretted it. Her gaze sharpened, a flicker of understanding in their blue depths. I gathered as much, she said softly. A tomb is a quiet, undemanding thing. A home, on the other hand, requires a great deal of effort. She picked up a sheet of paper from her desk. Effort which, until recently, has been sorely lacking. The roof over the east wing, for example, has almost entirely collapsed. I had the wing sealed off to prevent further water damage to the main structure. It saved us a small fortune in wasted heating, as you can see from the revised household expenditure report for the last quarter. She was talking to him about household expenditures. Him, the man who advised the king on matters of state, who moved armies with a stroke of his pen. She was reducing his return, his righteous anger, to a discussion of roof tiles and firewood. It was brilliant. It was infuriating. I did not return to Blackwood to discuss the household accounts with you, he said, stalking toward the desk. He was used to his size and presence intimidating people. He loomed over her, trying to cast her in his shadow. She did not shrink back. She simply looked up at him, her neck craned slightly, and waited. The ink smudge on her cheek was a small, defiant flag. "Then why did you return, Your Grace?" she asked, her tone genuinely curious. "You made it quite clear that you had no interest in this place, or its inhabitants." The last word was delivered with a precise, surgical emphasis that cut him to the quick. "This is my home. This is my desk," he said, placing his hands flat on its polished surface, claiming his territory. "It is a piece of furniture," she replied calmly, "and it has been put to better use in the last 6 months than it has in the last 20 years, I'll wager. As for this house, you abandoned it. You cannot abandon a thing and still claim ownership of its soul. You left a corpse, Your Grace. I simply declined to be part of the funeral arrangements." His anger, which had been a hot, roaring fire, suddenly cooled into something else. A grudging, bewildered respect. Her words were not emotional or accusatory. They were statements of fact. Cold, hard, and utterly undeniable. He had left her to die. She had refused. She had not only refused, she had taken the very instrument of her intended demise, this cold, decaying house, and forged it into a shield, a fortress, a life. He straightened up, moving away from the desk to the fireplace. He stared into the flames, his back to her. The warmth felt alien on his skin. "Mrs. Gable," he said, changing tactics. "Thorne informed me you dismissed her." "I did," she confirmed. "She was incompetent, disrespectful, and stealing from you blind. Her cousin in the village was supplying the estate with third-rate goods at twice the price, a fact she was profiting from handsomely. You will find the details in the red ledger. I have initiated proceedings through your London solicitor to recover the funds." He turned slowly to face her. "You contacted my solicitor?" "Of course," she said, as if it were the most obvious thing in the world. "He works for the estate, does he not? And as the acting mistress of the estate, I required his services to collect on overdue rents from your London properties as well. They had not been adjusted for inflation in 15 years. A shocking oversight." He stared at her, speechless. This woman, this sickly girl he had bought for a pittance, had taken over his entire life. She had not just tidied up a country house. She had streamlined his finances, fired his corrupt staff, and was chasing down his debtors. He, the great Duke of Blackwood, a master of political strategy, had been outmaneuvered in his own home by a woman he had assumed was nothing more than a ghost in waiting. The absurdity of the situation struck him. It was so complete, so total, that his anger evaporated, leaving behind a hollow space. He did not know what to feel. "I came here for silence," he said finally, the words quiet, almost a confession. "I am sorry to have disappointed you," she said, and for the first time, he heard a note of something other than cool composure in her voice. It might have been sincerity. It might have been pity. He could not tell. A new dynamic was being forged in the heat of that room. His authority, which he had always taken for granted, was not just challenged here. It was irrelevant. The staff's loyalty was not to his title, but to her actions. The house's warmth was not from his wealth, but from her will. He was an intruder, a stranger in a place that bore his name, but now answered to her spirit. He walked to the window and looked out. The walled garden, which he remembered as a riot of weeds, was now a neat, orderly grid of autumn crops. He could see two figures, Thorn and a younger lad, banking earth up against a row of leeks. They were working with a purpose he had never seen on this estate before. Her purpose. "You were not meant to survive," he said, his voice flat, speaking more to the glass than to her. "Then perhaps you should have chosen a more effective poison than neglect, Your Grace," she retorted, her voice sharp again. "I have found it to be a remarkably potent motivator." He turned back from the window. He looked at her, really looked at her, seeing not the commodity he had purchased, but the woman who sat before him, formidable and unbowed. The power struggle he had anticipated was already over. He had lost before he had even arrived. "I see," he said, and for the first time in a very long time, he did. The days that followed were a cold war fought in the corridors of a house that was now too small for the both of them. Alistair found himself a ghost in truth, haunting the edges of the vibrant, efficient world Alara had built. He was the Duke, the master of the house, and yet he had no purpose within it. The small, loyal staff were polite to him, but their deference was reserved for her. They looked to her for orders, for decisions, for the final word. When he tried to issue a command, it was met with a hesitant, "I'll have to ask Her Grace." He took his meals alone in the vast, echoing dining hall, a solitary figure at the end of a long, polished table. She ate in her study, or with the staff in the warm, bustling kitchen, a practice that horrified and fascinated him in equal measure. The silence he had craved was now a punishment, amplifying his own irrelevance. The house was filled with the sounds of life, the chopping of wood, the laughter of the maids, the clatter of pots from the kitchen, but he was not a part of it. He was an observer, sealed behind a wall of his own making. The weather turned, as if sensing the conflict within the manor's walls. An early, brutal winter swept down from the north, bringing with it a wind that howled like a hungry wolf and a rain that turned to sleet, then to a thick, driving snow. The world outside the windows vanished into a swirling vortex of white. The house, which had become a fortress of warmth, was now a besieged outpost. Alara had prepared for it. The cellars were stocked with potatoes, carrots, and onions from her garden. The woodsheds were full. The granaries were secure. She had spent the last weeks working relentlessly, ensuring the tenant families had what they needed, that the livestock were safe, that every chink and crack in their defenses was sealed. She worked from dawn until long after dusk, her energy a burning flame against the encroaching cold. Alistair watched her, a reluctant admirer. He saw the toll the work was taking on her, the faint, bluish shadows under her eyes, the return of a slight rasp to her voice. He had expected her to be fragile, but she was forged from something stronger than steel, sheer, indomitable will. But even steel can be broken. The storm raged for 3 days, cutting them off completely from the outside world. On the 4th day, the snow stopped, leaving behind a world of profound, white silence. The temperature plummeted. A deep, biting frost settled over the land. It was Beth, her face pale with terror, who came to find him. He was in the library, staring blankly at a book he hadn't been reading, the words a meaningless blur. "Your Grace," the girl whispered, her hands twisting in her apron. "It's Her Grace. She's taken ill." Alistair felt a cold dread that had nothing to do with the frost outside. He followed the maid to Alara's room. The warmth she had cultivated in the house seemed to have been drawn into this one space, where a massive fire roared in the grate, but could not touch the woman in the bed. She was no longer the magnificent ruler from the study. She was frighteningly frail, lost in the sheets, her face flushed with a dangerous, blotchy fever. Her breath came in shallow, ragged gasps, a terrible, wet, rattling sound that filled the room. The overwork, the relentless cold, had breached her defenses. The old sickness had returned, but this time it was not a quiet fading. It was a violent assault. Thorne was there, his weathered face a mask of grim concern. The cook was hovering helplessly by the door. They looked at him, their eyes filled with a desperate, unspoken plea. The local doctor was miles away, beyond the impassable snowdrifts. Their capable, unshakable leader had fallen, and they were lost. In that moment, Alistair's title, his wealth, his political power were utterly useless. He could not command the snow to melt. He could not summon a physician from London. He was as helpless as they were. And yet, they were looking to him, because in her absence, the ducal coronet had settled, heavy and unwanted, back on his head. He felt a surge of something he had not felt since the battlefield, the cold, clear-headed focus of a commander in a crisis. Panic was a luxury they could not afford. "Beth, fetch more blankets," he ordered, his voice sharp, cutting through the terrified paralysis in the room. "Cook, keep broth simmering on the fire. Hot and strong tea. Thorne, we need to keep this fire a furnace. Don't let it slacken for a moment." The staff, grateful for the direction, scurried to obey. Alistair moved to the bedside. He looked down at Alara. Her eyes were closed, her dark lashes stark against the feverish skin. She was muttering, her words nonsensical fragments. He reached out and laid a hand on her forehead. She was burning up. The terror he had felt moments before returned, but it was different now. It was not the abstract dread of a problem he could not solve. It was a sharp, personal fear. He thought of the silence he had come here seeking, the silence of the grave. He imagined this house without her, without the sounds of her crisp, clear voice giving orders, without the scent of the herbs she grew, without the sheer force of her will that held it all together. The silence he had craved now seemed a horrifying, unendurable void. He could not let her die. He would not. He pulled a chair to the bedside. He took a cloth from the basin of water and wrung it out, the skills learned in field hospitals during the war returning with a grim familiarity. He bathed her face, her neck, trying to bring the fever down. He listened to the terrible sound of her breathing, the battle being waged in her lungs. For 2 days and 2 nights, he did not leave her side. He became the general of this small, desperate war. He directed the staff, ensuring a constant supply of hot water, clean linens, and wood for the fire. He forced spoonfuls of broth and tea between her fever-cracked lips when she could swallow. He sat through the long, dark hours of the night, listening to her ragged breaths, watching the rise and fall of her chest. His entire world narrowed to that single, vital rhythm. In the dead of the second night, with the wind howling outside and the fire casting dancing shadows on the walls, he found himself talking to her. He did not know why he started. Perhaps it was to fill the terrifying silence between her gasps for air. Perhaps it was to keep himself awake. Or perhaps it was to keep her tethered to the world of the living, to give her a voice to hold onto in the darkness. He told her things he had never spoken of to another living soul. He told her about the war, not the grand strategies, but the mud, the fear, the face of the first man he had killed. He told her about his father, a cold, demanding man who had seen him only as an heir, a tool for the family's advancement. He told her about the suffocating weight of the dukedom, the endless, soul-crushing duty. He spoke of the emptiness that had settled in him after the war, the hollowness that all the power and politics in London could not fill. He confessed his sins to her unconscious form. He told her why he had married her. "I needed an heir, but I could not bear a life," he whispered into the firelit gloom. "I could not bear the thought of a wife, a family, demanding something from me that I did not have to give. You were a solution, a neat, tidy, cruel solution." He looked at her, at the fierce, fragile life clinging on by a thread, the life he had so callously discounted. "I was a fool," he said, his voice raw. "I came here seeking a tomb, and I found a kingdom. Your kingdom." He did not know if she heard him. It did not matter. The words were for him as much as for her. In the crucible of that sick room, watching her fight for every breath, he was forced to confront the barrenness of his own existence. She had built a world from nothing, a world of warmth and purpose and life, while he had presided over a gilded cage of power and emptiness. Section The crisis had stripped him bare, peeling away the layers of ducal arrogance and political detachment. He was not a duke, not a strategist, not a power broker. He was just a man, terrified of losing the one person who had shown him what it meant to be truly alive. He leaned forward, his elbows on his knees, and watched her, his vigil a silent, desperate prayer. The storm broke on the 5th day. The wind died down, and a pale, watery sun appeared, casting a brilliant, blinding glare on the new-fallen snow. And in the quiet, sunlit room, the fever broke too. Alara drifted up from a deep, dark place. The first thing she was aware of was the silence. The terrible, rattling struggle in her chest had eased, replaced by a deep, aching soreness. Her breathing was still shallow, but it was clear. The second thing she noticed was the warmth, a profound, bone-deep heat that seemed to radiate from the fire. The third thing was the man asleep in the chair by her bed. It was the Duke. He was slumped in the armchair, his head fallen back at an awkward angle, his long legs stretched out before him. The ducal mask was gone, erased by exhaustion. In its place was the face of a man, unguarded and utterly human. There were dark circles under his eyes, a rough stubble of beard on his jaw, and his immaculate clothes were rumpled and stained. He looked haggard, vulnerable, and more real than she had ever seen him. She lay there for a long time, just watching him. Her mind was a quiet, empty landscape, the memories of the fever a confusing jumble of darkness, pain, and a low, resonant voice speaking of war and duty and regret. She felt weak, as if her bones had been turned to water, but her mind was sharp and clear. On the bedside table, within easy reach, was a cup of tea. It was cold now, a dark, stewed brew. Beside it was a plate with a piece of dry toast. Someone had tried to make her tea. Someone had tried to feed her. The gesture was so simple, so clumsy, so utterly at odds with the formidable, icy Duke she knew. It touched a place deep inside her that she had thought long since walled off, a place that had not been reached by his anger or her defiance. He stirred, groaning as his stiff muscles protested. His eyes fluttered open, gray and clouded with sleep. They focused on her, and for a moment, they were just a man's eyes, filled with a weary concern. Then recognition dawned, and the ducal garb began to slide back into place, but not before she had seen the raw, undisguised relief that flooded his face. "You're awake," he said, his voice a rough, gravelly whisper. He sat up straighter, running a hand through his disheveled hair. Alara tried to speak, but her throat was too raw. She managed only a dry, rasping sound. She pointed to the cup of tea. He understood immediately. He stood, his movements stiff, and fetched the pot from the hearth. He poured her a fresh cup, his large, scarred hand surprisingly steady. He brought it to her, and when he saw that she was too weak to sit up, he hesitated for only a second before reaching behind her and carefully, gently, lifting her shoulders, propping her up against the pillows. His arm was a solid, warm weight behind her. The contact was practical, necessary, but it sent a jolt of awareness through her that had nothing to do with her illness. She sipped the hot, sweet tea, the warmth spreading through her chest. After a few sips, she found her voice. It was a weak, reedy thing, but it was hers. "The storm," she whispered. "Is it over?" "Yes," he said, his arms still supporting her. "It's over." She looked past him, through the window, at the brilliant, sunlit snow. The world looked clean and new. She thought of the estate, of the 1,000 practical details that had consumed her before the fever. "The roof," she rasped. "The roof over the west granary, it will have leaked. The snow will be heavy." She expected him to dismiss her concern, to tell her not to worry her head about such trivial matters. She expected the cold, detached Duke to reassert himself. Instead, he looked at her, his expression serious, and nodded. "I know," he said. "Thorn and I will see to it, as soon as the drifts are clear enough to pass." Thorn and I. The two words were a revolution. He was no longer the absent landlord, the ghostly observer. He was including himself in the work, in the life of the estate. The partnership she had forged with his groundsman, he was now quietly joining. She finished the tea and sank back against the pillows, her strength spent. He removed his arm and sat back down in the chair, the space between them filled with a new, uncertain silence. It was not the hostile silence of their first confrontation, nor the empty silence of his initial neglect. It was a watchful, waiting quiet. In the days that followed, a truce settled over Blackwood Manor. Alara slowly regained her strength, confined first to her bed, then to her room. Alistair remained. He did not retreat into the library or the cold formality of the dining hall. He became a quiet, constant presence. He would bring her meals himself, simple trays prepared by the now-devoted cook. He would stoke her fire, his large frame bent in service to the hearth. He would read to her in the evenings, not from poetry or novels, but from dry agricultural journals he had found in the library, his low, resonant voice a soothing balm. They began to talk, not of the past, not of the contract that had brought them together, but of practical, present things. They talked of crop rotation, of drainage, of the merits of different breeds of sheep for the high moorland pastures. He, who had dealt in the fates of nations, found himself genuinely engrossed in the fate of a field of winter wheat. She, who had fought for every scrap of her authority, found herself listening to his surprisingly astute observations, drawn from a youth spent on the land he had long since forgotten. One afternoon, she was finally strong enough to make it downstairs to her study. She found him there, at her desk, a stack of her ledgers before him. A flash of the old defiance sparked in her. He was reclaiming his territory. But then she saw that he was not reviewing her work. He was continuing it. He was using his own elegant script to make notes in the margins, cross-referencing a tenant dispute with a complex point of property law he had recalled from his own ducal responsibilities. He looked up as she entered, no hint of appropriation in his expression. The miller at Stoke Cross is claiming a right-of-way that has been defunct since 1789, he said, as if they were in the middle of a long-standing conversation. I found the relevant deed in my father's papers. He's trying to cheat you. You, not us. He still saw this as her domain. He was offering his expertise not as a master, but as a consultant, an ally. She walked over to the desk and looked over his shoulder. The silence between them was comfortable now, a shared space of collaboration. They worked together for an hour, their heads bent over the old, crackling maps of the estate, their hands occasionally brushing as they pointed to a boundary line or a watercourse. Each touch was a small, grounding anchor, a physical manifestation of their new partnership. He found a strange, unexpected peace in this new life. The physical labor he undertook with Thorne, clearing snow, repairing a collapsed stone wall, mucking out a stable, was honest and real. It left him tired, but it was a clean exhaustion, a world away from the soul-deep weariness of London. The results were tangible. A mended fence, a dry barn. He was building something, not just dismantling the ambitions of other men. He watched her. He watched as the color fully returned to her face, as her strength came back, as she resumed her command of the house with a quiet, confident grace. He respected her. That was a simple, undeniable fact. But as he watched her laugh at something one of the kitchen maids said, her face alight with a warmth he had never seen, he realized with a jolt that it was more than respect. He had married her because he could not bear to have a life demand anything of him. He had banished her to a tomb because he was a ghost himself, but she had refused to be a ghost. She had built a world of life and warmth from the ruins he had given her, and in saving her from the storm, he had inadvertently been drawn into her light. He, Alistair Beaumont, the haunted Duke of Blackwood, was beginning to feel something he had not felt in a lifetime. He was beginning to feel at home. The thaw came, and with it the world rushed back in. The roads became passable, and the rhythms of life beyond the estate's boundaries began to intrude. A postboy, for the first time in weeks, made his way up the newly cleared drive, a satchel of delayed mail on his back. Among the bills and local circulars was a letter bearing a familiar, imperious crest. Alistair saw it from the study window. A royal courier, his horse lathered, his uniform spattered with the mud of a hard ride. He was a messenger from another world, the world of politics and duty that Alistair had almost managed to forget. A cold knot formed in his stomach. He had known this was an interlude, a temporary peace. He had not realized how fiercely he would resent its end. The courier was shown into the hall, a stark, official presence in the warm, domestic space. He bowed stiffly. "Your Grace." An urgent dispatch from His Majesty. He held out a heavy vellum envelope, sealed with the royal signet in dark red wax. Alistair took it. The feel of it in his hand was a physical weight, pulling him back to London, back to the endless, intricate games of power. Alara had entered the hall from the kitchen, a smudge of flour on her apron. She stopped dead when she saw the courier, the royal seal, the dispatch in her husband's hand. Her face, which had been relaxed and animated, became a still, blank mask. The warmth in her eyes was extinguished, replaced by a cool, distant formality. She saw the summons for what it was, the end. Of course, he was a duke. His world was not here, in this small, reclaimed pocket of the world. His world was out there at the right hand of the king. This time together, this fragile partnership born of a snowstorm, had been nothing more than a convalescence for them both. An aberration. She had allowed herself to forget who he was. She had allowed herself to believe this could last. She had been a fool. Her defenses, which had been so painstakingly lowered, slammed back into place, higher and stronger than ever. The wall between them was instantly rebuilt, brick by painful brick. "Your Grace will require his dress uniform to be packed," she said, her voice devoid of all emotion. She turned to Beth, who had followed her into the hall. "See to it, and inform the stables that the Duke's traveling coach is to be made ready at once." She was the perfect, efficient chatelaine, arranging her master's departure. She did not look at him. She could not bear to see the relief she was sure must be on his face, the eagerness to return to his real life. The pain of it was a sharp, physical ache in her chest, worse than any sickness. Alistair watched her. He saw the wall go up, saw the light in her die. He heard the cold, formal title she used for him, a name she had not called him in weeks. And he felt a sudden, violent rebellion against it all, against the summons, against the king, against the life that was trying to reclaim him. He looked down at the dispatch in his hand. It represented everything he had been raised to be, a man of duty, of power, of consequence. His father's voice echoed in his memory, cold and insistent. "Your only duty is to the crown and to this family's name." He looked at the life he had here, the smell of wood smoke, the satisfaction of a repaired wall, the quiet comfort of working beside a woman whose strength humbled him, the warmth. He looked at Alara, at her rigid back, at the protective shell she had pulled around herself. He saw not just a partner, but the architect of his own salvation. She had not just rebuilt a house. She had given him a glimpse of what it might be like to have a home, to have a purpose that was not about power, but about life itself. The choice was so clear it was staggering. There was no choice at all. He walked past the stunned courier, past the waiting staff, to the great fireplace that was the heart of the hall. The fire, the one Alara had insisted upon, the one that had chased the ghost from the corners, was blazing. Alara turned, her eyes wide, as he approached it. Without a word, Alistair held the royal dispatch over the flames. The wax seal melted, dripped, and then the corner of the vellum caught. It blackened, curled, and then erupted in a bright, clean flame. A collective gasp went through the room. The courier's mouth fell open in horror. It was an act of unthinkable defiance, a direct insult to the king. It was treason. Alara stared, her heart hammering against her ribs. She could not breathe. She could not comprehend what she was seeing. Alistair let the burning paper drop from his fingers into the heart of the fire, where it was consumed in seconds, turning to black, fluttering ash. He then turned to face the room, to face his wife. His expression was calm, resolute, and utterly certain. "My duties have changed," he announced, his voice ringing with an authority that had nothing to do with his title and everything to do with the man he had become. He looked directly at Alara, his gaze holding hers, stripping away the walls between them. My place is no longer at court. My place is here. He took a step toward her, his eyes never leaving hers. He saw the shock, the disbelief, the dawning, fragile hope in their blue depths. "You're my home now, Ilara," he said, the words a simple, profound declaration. It was not a plea, not a promise. It was a statement of fact, a truth he had discovered in the quiet heart of a snowstorm. The ice in Ilara's heart, the wall she had built so swiftly, did not just crack. It shattered. It dissolved into a flood of emotion so overwhelming she felt her knees weaken. The tears she had refused to shed in sickness, in poverty, in abandonment, finally fell. They were not tears of sadness or relief, but of a deep, soul-shaking recognition. He saw her. He had finally, truly seen her. She did not speak. Words were inadequate for what she felt. Instead, she took a hesitant step toward him, and then another. She closed the distance between them, and, for the first time, she leaned on him. She rested her forehead against the solid wall of his chest, her hands clutching his coat, and let him take her weight. Alistair wrapped his arms around her, holding her close. She was so slender, yet he could feel the incredible strength that radiated from her. He rested his chin on the top of her head, breathing in the faint, clean scent of her hair. He felt the last of the hollow places inside him fill up. The ghost was gone. He looked over her head at the stunned courier. "You may tell His Majesty," he said, his voice quiet but absolute, "that the Duke of Blackwood sends his regrets. He is otherwise engaged. He is building a life." They stood there for a long time, holding each other in the center of the great hall, before the fire he had stoked, in the house she had reclaimed. The staff, after a moment of stunned silence, quietly melted away, leaving them in a circle of warmth and light. Outside, the winter winds could howl their fury. The world of politics and power could rage. It did not matter. Here in this house that was no longer a tomb, but a living, breathing thing, they were a fortress. They were a partnership. They were fiercely, defiantly, and completely whole. The Duke had come home.